I like the way you smile at me, baby.
Horror games are a dime a dozen these days, but when one comes along that actually does a good job with the genre, you kind of have to stop and take notice. Such is the case with Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, developed by Headfirst Productions. As a shooter, it often trips and stumbles, but as a horror game, it practically ticks all the boxes. I'm not the biggest Lovecraft aficionado, though I have read the Shadow Over Innsmouth, which is a short story that forms the basis for the plot. Along with that, there's also elements and characters from the Call of Cthulhu Mythos, namely Cthulhu himself, who sadly doesn't make an appearance. Instead, the focus of the story is on a man named Jack Walters, an average dude with a messed up past. A brief prologue sets up the story perfectly as Jack takes part in a police raid on a mansion inhabited by crazed cultists. Soon turns out these guys worship Cthulhu, and pretty shortly after that, Jack succumbs to madness as he comes into contact with some strange ancient beings. After a brief tenure in Arkham Asylum, he gets back on the horse, takes on a career as a private detective, and heads off to the town of Innsmouth to investigate a missing persons case. And this is the point where things start to kick off. The game is first and foremost a horror game, combined with some first-person shooting and a lot of puzzle solving. Items are found in the environments and stored in an inventory system, which you're going to have to monitor and utilize when completing objectives. The brunt of your inventory is going to be filled with ammo and items you come across. Some of these items are more obvious than others, which can lead to a bit of frustration. If you're going to give this game a try, let me just suggest that you grab a walkthrough beforehand, as this may just be the most confusing and complex game I've ever played. The main reason for this is the lack of a heads-up display. Obviously they did this to immerse the player a lot more in the game, but it also means you're given very little indication as to what the hell you're supposed to be doing. Jack will often mutter something under his breath about what you have to do next, but if you're doing something else at the time, you'll most likely miss this. Puzzles often require lots of backtracking, and there's a few timed sequences which come down to the wire. I found the game a lot more enjoyable when I just bit the bullet and looked at a guide online. It's not a cop-out, believe me, this game really is that difficult. The first few hours of the game are all primarily about stealth and mystery. Jack's arrival in Innsmouth is heightened by the elusive nature of its inhabitants.
This is it, stranger. End of the line.
And his initial objective is just to find the missing person. Most of this is accomplished by talking to people about town, and there's a nice chunk of dialogue to be heard in the game, which can come off a bit cheesy, but most of the time it hits the mark.
I'm from out of town. The order doesn't hold much sway with me.
Things aren't really what they seem though, and when he digs too deep, he pisses off the locals, who soon take to trying to kill him in his sleep, in what may honestly be one of the most terrifying scripted sequences in any game ever. After that, you spend your time sneaking unarmed through the town, largely avoiding enemies whilst trying to escape. When you do finally get your hands on a weapon, the game takes a bit of a shift and turns into more of an all-out shooting fest. There's a real juxtaposition between this and the first areas in the game, as ammo becomes abundant and you team up with friendly allies and even the FBI at one point to bring a stop to all of the evildoers in Innsmouth once and for all. By the end of the game, you're walking around with army rifles, Tommy guns and revolvers, and you might think that that would remove the horror element, but it really doesn't. There's always this very thick and foreboding sense of dread, and the major contributor to this is the visuals, but the sound definitely plays a large part. A few horror sequences in the game defy convention and really caught me off guard. And while it's got its fair share of jump scares, the real atmosphere comes from what you don't see as opposed to what you do. These horror scenes are intensified by various visual and audio effects that are meant to simulate Jack's wearying mental state. His vision becomes blurry and shaky as he struggles to deal with the events unfolding, and these moments often occur when you look at something disturbing like a mangled corpse or when you dangle high above ledges or large drops. But of course it ain't all sunshine and roses. While the game has only two main playstyles, stealth and shooting, it doesn't really excel at either of them. They're not bad, they're just not as refined as what you'd get from a game that was primarily a stealth or shooting game. The sneaking controls give little to no indication of how visible you are to enemies, often resulting in being spotted when you would assume you were hidden from sight. When you're in a gunfight, you'll most likely notice that the shooting often feels loose and unpolished. Iron sights replace crosshairs here, which is all well and good, but Jack's hand often wobbles all over the place, making accurate shots a bit tricky. Jack himself is something of a delicate flower. The game isn't too hard and Jack is practically a bullet sponge, which makes it all the weirder how he seems to frequently break his leg or injure himself from doing something as menial as jumping off the top of a small crate. Also, as I said earlier, it's often a very difficult game puzzle-wise. Some of the puzzles border on being downright ludicrous. One boss fight later in the game requires you to hit a gong with your weapon, then quickly run up a ramp and stand in a particular spot to take control of the enemies. It sounds simple enough, but the process has to be done in a very specific way or it just doesn't work. There's also a few bugs in the game that actually make the game unfinishable without a fan-made patch, and that's just not on. But I can overlook most of these problems largely because the content on the whole is really top-notch, original and ultimately captivating. There's so few games based on the Cthulhu mythos that you can't afford not to play them if you're even remotely a fan of the short stories. I'm not going to pretend this game is perfect, it's far from it, but it does deliver some genuinely scary moments and has a consistently solid level of writing throughout.
J. Edgar Hoover, from the Bureau. And considering your position, Mr. Walters, you best mind your manners.
It's available on Steam if you're interested in checking it out, but just make sure you go in with an open mind and a lot of spare time.